Okay, so hey everyone, thank you for tuning in. And here I have today a very distinguished guest, Michael Strong. He is the this is a long list of things. He's the CEO of Flow, which stands for Freedom Lights Our World, the CEO of Radical Social Entrepreneurs, and the co-founder of KoSchool. That's spelled K-O School. Um, he's also the former director of education programs at the wonderful Institute for Humane Studies, and he studied at Harvard University, St. John's College, and University of Chicago. He is also the co-author of the book Be the Solution: How Entrepreneurs and Conscious Capitalists Can Solve All the World's Problems. How are you doing, Michael?
I'm
I think the connection just kind of cut
Liam.
out.
Can you hear me?
I can barely I can hear
Yes.
you, but I can't really see. It's like very pixelated. Just say something.
Uh,
Okay,
um,
I can hear you now.
I can hear you.
Great.
Okay, great.
Can you see me though?
Yeah, I'm well, and I can see you. A little bit slow and pixelated from time to time,
Oh, okay.
but uh,
Well,
but I'm delighted and well.
I think since we can hear each other, that's all that really matters. My viewers can just close their eyes and imagine that they're seeing something. So I have a lot I want to talk to you about, but as we were kind of talking before we officially started, I came across you because I was following the work of Patri Friedman, and he's written very highly of you on. He has there's a blog. I know you have written guest posts on it. I think it's like 1,000 Nations Blossom. I don't remember exactly what it's called. Um,
Let a thousand nations bloom. It's
yes,
called Let a Thousand
yes,
Nations.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's very interesting. I'm very much interested in startup cities and kind of because I come from a libertarian perspective, and I'm trying to figure out the best way that I can kind of influence the world. And I've been very dismayed with the political process. I just don't see it as being an effective way of making change. There's certain things you can do with it, but to really make a real difference in the world, I don't see that as the correct avenue. And there's a lot of other areas that you can do, such as education. I know you work a lot in education, so we could definitely have a lot of discussion about that. That's going to be very interesting. Um, but I think one of these things, yeah, startup cities is what I one thing I really like. And so yeah, I was reading some Patri Friedman. He kept referencing you, so I looked you up, and that's kind of how I came across your thing. And I did know about Conscious Capitalism and John Mackey, who you work with. So I knew about that. I never knew about you until relatively recently. But then I started following you on Facebook, and you post some really great stuff. So I'm always liking what you have, just good content. So yeah, that's basically what happened. So I think we should start off by kind of talking about kind of some of these organizations that you co-founded slash are involved with. So the first is Flow. And this, I guess, is sort of like an umbrella organization that has several different projects like Conscious Capitalism and Peace Through Commerce and Radical Social Entrepreneurs. Could you explain kind of what is Flow and
Sure.
without getting into the sub projects?
Sure. So I'm going to give you a little bit more background and
Sure.
context. So, I'm very much a do-gooder. I want to make the world a better place. John Lennon, give peace a chance. All of that good stuff, and really create a world where 7, 8 billion, whatever it is, people flourish. Um, I originally came from the left because that's what you hear is that's what the left is about. I then went to the University of Chicago to study the Chicago economists up close. I thought, how can they pretend to be scientists and be for free markets? Because, at the ripe old age of 22, I knew, as do all leftists, that free markets were evil.
Right.
And I realized within a few years, I really didn't know much about economics, nor did I know much about the complications of governance. I was actually depressed for a couple of years as I realized most of the progressive publications and professors that I used to respect were generally inadequate and empirically unfounded in their beliefs. So I gradually became much more free market. I ended up starting a dissertation under Gary Becker on ideas and culture as human capital, and that's been a strand that continues. While working on my dissertation under Becker, I worked for the Paideia Project in Chicago, training teachers to lead Socratic seminars in Chicago public schools. That led to a 15-year career in education, creating programs and then private and a charter school based on Socratic principles. So all this gets up to John Mackey and Flow, so I just wanted to give that background.
Yeah, sure.
So then I met Gary Hoover, who's a entrepreneur. He had created a bookstop, the first big box bookstore in Austin, Texas, and his first bookstop was next to John Mackey's second Whole Foods back in Austin in the late 70s. So I met Gary Hoover, and he and I both shared an interest in Chicago econ on the one hand and education on the other. And I said I wanted to create the Whole Foods of education. And Gary said, well, I want to create the Target of education, but I know this guy. So Gary introduced me to John Mackey. At the time, I thought or hoped that maybe John would fund some of my education projects. But as John and I got going, it turns out he wasn't too interested in education, but he was very interested in our shared history of having come from the left and become libertarian. I've become more libertarian as I've gotten older, and way beyond Chicago, I'm now much more Austrian, huge respect for robust political economy, public choice, all of that. And so big Hayekian. So when John and I started talking, we realized that at the time, libertarians sort of had this brand of, these sort of skeezy dudes out in their unzoned backyards shooting up Russian cars with machine guns while maybe, hitting the heroin and watching porn or something like that. Right. What creeps, basically. Yeah. Whereas, John and I just want to make the world a better place. I did it through a bunch of schools. He did it through Whole Foods. We both knew how dysfunctional government was. Let's just make the world a better place. And so gradually our conversations led to the founding of Flow. And Flow is focused on entrepreneurial solutions to world problems. One problem with a lot of libertarians is it comes across as we're just against taxes and regulations and naysayers and obstructionists and all of this. And it's like, no. No, it's not about being against taxes and regulations. It's about being for human flourishing through entrepreneurial solutions. And at the time, microfinance, Muhammad Yunus was cool. The whole tech entrepreneurship thing had been cool for a while. Steve Jobs, yada, yada, yada. Social entrepreneurship had become big, Ashoka and Echoing Green and all of these programs where do-gooders were starting to realize they should be entrepreneurial and produce value and so forth. Mission-driven products. What later became Conscious Capitalism is already kind of germinated in John's mind, certainly. So we looked at, let's really talk about entrepreneurial solutions to world problems, and then we can get all of these well-intentioned people who really do want to make the world a better place, aligned with policies that very often make the world a worse place. And sometimes, in the case of Marxism, a much worse place. Right. So that led to Flow. And after a few years of Flow, we realized that entrepreneurial solutions to world problems was just much too broad. I think it's cool and I still like it. But, it's something hard for most people to grok their minds around. So we started with something called Peace Through Commerce. I'd done a lot of research on all the ways in which entrepreneurs, markets, economic freedom can lead to peace and human flourishing. And, I still regard the potential of war as the most serious issue there is. So we held a number of conferences. I wrote some articles and so forth. We, worked towards getting some momentum around this idea of let's be committed to peace through commerce. And there are still people carrying that legacy on. Our second one was accelerating women entrepreneurs, where we thought, hey, yeah, microfinance is great, but it's a little bit condescending to say that developing world women are only capable of buying a chicken and selling eggs. Why don't we support developing world women who are creating $20 million, $30 million, $50 million businesses? So we actually gathered a group of people who support women entrepreneurs and developing women entrepreneurs, and really to promote this notion. As it turns out, one of the women who attended that is a Senegalese entrepreneur named Magat Wade, who's now my wife. Oh. So she likes to joke that it was a pickup strategy. Where, and I'll acknowledge, yeah, we gathered best developing world women entrepreneurs in a room, and I picked the best one and married her.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and Magat's fabulous. People can Google her. She's a celebrity in her own right. She is really passionate, and her big goal is for Senegal to become prosperous and proud and happy and dignified and so forth. And all of her entrepreneurial efforts are directed towards that goal. And I work with her a lot on her Senegalese projects, which gives me a lot of on-the-ground experience in developing world countries.
Wow, that's okay. Yeah, go on. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to get. There's lots.
No, no,
More
yeah, I know. No, I don't want to
um,
disrail this. This is good.
meanwhile, John Mackey had liked both peace through commerce and developing world accelerating women entrepreneurs, and so he said, let's do the same kind of programmatic strategy for conscious capitalism. So we gathered groups of people to kind of think about what that would become, and John had really thought out a lot of the tenets of conscious capitalism. He had a debate in Reason magazine with T.J. Rogers and Milton Friedman on the purpose of business. And for John, it's really, the purpose is to make the world a better place. And, a lot of entrepreneurs have a purpose other than profit maximization. And, Whole Foods may be one of the largest companies that's very much committed to, purposes beyond profit. Yes, you have to be profitable. Absolutely, profits are healthy and good. Not a trace of apology or resentment about profitability. But it's also, I think, human psychology that most of us, want to have an impact on the world in addition to the profitability. So conscious capitalism has grown. Alexander McCoben, formerly the founder of Students for Liberty, is now the CEO of Conscious Capitalism. It's got chapters all over the book. The book that John co-wrote with Raj Sisodia has got a lot of press, so forth. So that's another kind of successful stepchild, so to speak, a spin-off. Meanwhile, I had become more and more interested in not only peace through commerce, but also poverty, and partly working with...
Hello? I'm sorry, it's just...
poor countries...
I can't hear you.
Okay. Hear me now?
Yeah, I think it just glitched out for a little bit. You were saying that you just said that before it cut out. It said that you were interested in poverty.
Exactly. So, I became ever more deeply interested in poverty, and there's a lot of evidence that basically legal systems and a lack of economic freedom are the cause of poverty. That is, conversely, if countries have solid property rights, rule of law, and sufficient economic freedom, they're prosperous. The correlations between economic freedom, which incorporates measures for property rights and rule of law, and prosperity are extremely powerful. So then the question becomes, how do we increase economic freedom? And in particular, how do we improve the legal systems of poor countries? So, if you look at, say, the special economic zones of China, they've brought about 600 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years.
Wow.
And the average urban wage in China has gone from $1,000 a year 20 years ago to about $6,000 a year today. So you consider a six-fold increase for 600 million, families.
It's amazing.
It's the greatest moral victory. Arguably, you probably slavery, the end of slavery, and of course there's still slavery, but the delegitimization and the reduction in slavery may be the single biggest moral victory in human history. But arguably, globalization is the second biggest victory, with the Chinese case standing out. So it's like, wow. And China, problems, yeah, but still, 6,000 a year is better than 1,000. Meanwhile, India is going online and so forth. A lot of people escape poverty in India. Africa is lagged. So then I was talking to people in the free zone industry. I met a couple of pioneers in the free zone industry, and they were aware that some zones worked and some zones didn't. And then you get into, why do some zones work and why do some zones not work? And that's really how I started going more and more deeply into what became startup cities. It turns out, certainly one of the factors for zone success is, private investment. That is, when governments try to create zones, very often they become crony capitalist projects where, your brother-in-law or the president's brother-in-law gets a deal, and the cousins all get rich, and nobody else really benefits. Sort of an exaggeration, but still, government subsidized zones have problems. Lotte Moberg is a GMU PhD who's written a great book on this, on the robust political economy of special economic zones. And then the other issue with zones is, okay, zones typically do reduce taxes and regulations, but sorry about that.
Okay.
But then you still have the problem of weak property rights and rule of law. So even with poor taxes or lower taxes and fewer regulations, if you have insecure property rights and you have terrible rule of law, nobody's going to invest there. And ultimately, this comes back to how do we get companies to invest, their capital, and how can we allow for productive enterprise to take place in poor nations where it's currently not taking place at an adequate rate. Meanwhile, I'm going towards kind of the involvement in startup cities and the Honduras project in particular. I had been training professors at Universidad Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala in Socratic discussion, and the former president there, Giancarlo Ibrahim, was a very dear friend of mine. And he and I, both were very committed to both free markets and making the world a better place. He had been involved with some of the leadership in Honduras when they developed this idea to create what became the ZEDEs, Zones for Economic Development and Employment. So just to go into that a little bit, these are all fascinating stories. The ZEDEs really were the brainchild of a small group of classical liberal attorneys within the Honduran government. Originally, they had been working on the Hernando de Soto project of property titling in Honduras, and so they were trying to develop a more secure and better documented property rights so that people would have more security in their property. One of them mentioned to me, over there's a 10-story building in Tegucigalpa that's been empty for 10 years. Why? Because the title is unclear, and titles are unclear. Nobody will invest. In other cases, there are all sorts of situations where farms will lay fallow for years and years at a time because of these property disputes. So when property is uncertain, productive assets, property, real estate in particular, can simply lie dormant for many years. So at any rate, after having this experience, then the Hondurans elected Manuel Zelaya. Zelaya was elected as a center-right candidate, but in the crash of 2008, he had gotten into a budget challenge. Basically, he was running huge deficits, and the government was going bankrupt. So he managed to become aligned with Hugo Chavez in exchange for oil money. Zelaya agreed to go hard left. So it's pure political opportunism, which it's not surprising. You said you were born in Peru?
No, I am not.
Oh, okay. I was reading somebody else. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem.
But yeah,
I am Hispanic,
America's crazy. Latin America can be crazy too.
Yeah.
So Zelaya went hard left, and among other things, he was using threats to try to pack the Supreme Court in Honduras. So at one point, he was threatening to have tanks overrun the Congress and to lock the Congress in their chambers, the Honduran Congress, until they named the Supreme Court candidate. So real crazy stuff. Yeah. Real crazy stuff. So eventually, the Honduran Supreme Court and the Honduran Congress and the Honduran military all got aligned. They took Zelaya in his pajamas to Costa Rica in the middle of the night and dumped him there. The entire world said, military coup, you got to bring your president back. Hillary Clinton went down there and said, bad Hondurans, we're not going to give you foreign aid and so forth. So anyway, but the Hondurans, to their credit, stuck by their guns. They knew that Zelaya was crazy. And after a period of time, they had elections, and President Lobo was elected. Most of the world finally conceded that Hondurans were right to do what they did. Later, a commission said that it was a constitutional crisis because there was just no clear constitutional path for what to do if your president is egregiously violating the law himself. So at any rate, in this situation, you had a really interesting situation where the political class of Honduras, including the left-leaning political class, knew that they could not trust the international community because the international community had basically betrayed them when they had all agreed that they wanted to get rid of Zelaya. And this made them much more open to radical alternatives than I think they otherwise would have been. So Octavio Sanchez, who is kind of the leader in the government, and Octavio Sanchez, after Lobo was elected, Octavio became Lobo's right-hand guy. So the other thing is, this is just an incredible coincidence where there'd been this group of, classical liberal attorneys with government experience who got in when their guy was elected after the Zelaya crisis. But now they were in and in power, and they'd long had dreams of this sort of thing. They're very sophisticated. They've got a lot of understanding of institutional economics, what's needed for prosperity. And about this time, Paul Romer, the famous Stanford economist, now at the World Bank, gave his TED Talk on charter cities. And these guys said, hey, let's get him down here to legitimize our idea. So they brought Romer down to legitimize their idea, and he spoke, famous Stanford economist, speaks to Congress, yada, yada, yada. They also flew key members of Congress across partisan lines. They were really good about making this, transpartisan. They flew a group of Congress to Singapore and Hong Kong, and so forth, to say, look, these places were poor 50 years ago, now they're rich. This is how it happens. And they managed to pass the first round of legislation almost unanimously. In one of the votes, a couple of votes, handful, and one vote there, I think there was one person just because he didn't like anything to be unanimous. But remarkable consensus. And it was originally Rede legislation, regiones, that allowed for zones with common law jurisdictions with more economic freedom than any jurisdiction in the world. So they really were designing zones that could be more free market than Hong Kong or Singapore. The other thing, just to riff on the common law side, is that, if you have poor rule of law, you're not going to get a capital investment. There's a fairly substantial case to be made that common law jurisdictions outperform civil law jurisdictions. Former British colonies on balance do better than former French, Spanish, or Portuguese jurisdictions. Give you two little anecdotes on that. One is just notary publics. Years ago, I met a Mexican entrepreneur woman who said that notaries are basically like the mafia. You can't get anything done without them. And since I've realized that throughout civil law countries, you need to get a document notarized costs between $500 to $1,000. In the U.S., you get a document notarized for free by your bank, or maybe pay $5, whatever.
Right. Yeah.
But basically, any American can get a document notarized. In the developing world, civil law countries, you have to already be relatively upper class in order to even engage in a legal business.
Wow.
Yeah, it's huge. I
didn't know.
And things like this. Like nobody knows this. So, Hernando de Soto estimates that, only about 10% of the population in Latin America is engaged in legal activity because the vast majority of people are in these, gray market areas. And what that means is they have no protections. They don't have title, they can't get insurance, but it goes beyond title. They can't have, equity in anything substantial. They can't buy or sell businesses, except by trust. Police can't protect them, and in fact, police can arbitrarily arrest them and harass them because they're illegal at any point in time. By the way, one more riff, the Tunisian street seller who immolated himself, burned himself to death and launched the Arab Spring. He was a merchant who was being harassed by bureaucrats because he didn't have the proper licenses. And this is a huge global problem, and nobody talks about it.
Wow.
So anyway, yeah, huge issues there. And then just one more riff on the common law thing. Dubai in 2002 wanted to become a global financial center. Sharia law, can't charge interest, not great for finance, but incredibly brilliant, practical minds in Dubai. They said, look, the world's best financial centers all run common law. London, New York, Chicago, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney. Let's just install common law in Dubai, and we'll create a financial center. Voila, they did. It's brilliant. They hired a retired British commercial law judge, retired Singaporean commercial law judge, and now they've got a board of something like 15 experienced commercial law judges with practice in common law, and on 110 acres in Dubai, they apply common law, and now Dubai is a top 20 global financial center in 15 years. So talk about jump-starting success.
Yeah,
Phenomenal.
15 years. That's so short.
Yeah, exactly. So then you look at, so Honduras, to their credit, said, okay, let's create common law jurisdictions. And so they allowed legislation so that private groups could do this. Going back to zones are more successful when private capital is involved because, you got to do a lot of due diligence. Will this location work? Will this community be supportive? Is there an adequate workforce with appropriate training and skills? Is the electricity reliable, or do we have to build our own supply? Whatever it is, private has to make really pragmatic investment decisions. So I was the head of a group that signed an agreement with the Honduran government. And Reason Magazine has kind of the best outline of this. Paul Romer resigned in protest, or quasi-resigned in protest. There was a big hullabaloo about this. What's interesting about this, to do just a riff on Romer, is that he had, although the Hondurans had this idea prior to his presence, he took it on as his project. He identified with it. And this is, I would say, really insulting. The Western media almost unanimously claimed it was Romer's project. It really was sort of, racist and insulting that the Hondurans needed Romer for this. I do want to give NPR credit. NPR, after this thing fell apart, did a really wonderful episode on Octavio Sanchez and Paul Romer and how they had originally collaborated, but eventually they kind of broke up, so to speak. And NPR is the only organization that gave Octavio adequate credit. So at any rate, Romer at one point created his own website claiming that he was on this commission. And he had apparently had a private meeting with Lobo, but there was never any paperwork in Honduras that did it. So basically a backdoor meeting. He put up this website, interviewed with The Economist. The Economist said Romer was on this committee. When we signed our deal with the Honduran government, we had heard about this, and we said, we need you to sign a statement saying that there is no, it's called a transparency commission. No transparency commission had been appointed. They did. So when Romer got all, unhappy, we pulled out this document and say, look, according to the Honduran government, there was never a commission created. Anyway, the whole media circus around that then inclined the Supreme Court judges to vote against it. They voted against it. It became unconstitutional. We thought the project was dead. Most of our team, disbanded. Then a few months later, Honduras the Honduran government fired the Supreme Court members who voted against it, which is dreadful in terms of rule of law.
Wow.
And then after that, they passed new legislation, which was actually better. And now I'm working with a group that is working from that new legislation. Just a quick riff on the way in which it's better is that the version which had been influenced by Romer allowed foreign governments to run jurisdictions. And one part of the blowback in Honduras was the concern of neocolonialism. So Romer was talking about, say, the Canadian government running a jurisdiction on Honduran soil. And, nobody likes that. It feels neocolonial. My wife, Senegalese, she actually told Romer to his face, look, this foreign government thing on our soil, totally neocolonial, never going to fly, can't do that. So the new legislation in Honduras is designed as an expansion of municipal autonomy rather than permission for external governments. So Honduran municipalities that already had more autonomy than they had been using, and this allowed them to do it. My power is running out, so I'm gonna move inside, and
Sure.
it's a beautiful spring day out there.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm gonna go in the shadows now inside.
That's okay. Yeah, it doesn't. You go wherever.
So I've got, as I say, a lot of details. Is it okay if I just keep going on the Honduran ZEDEs?
Yeah, I really like the ZEDEs, and this is like so much stuff I didn't know. So this is like a great. I don't know if there's like an article that outlines this, but if there was, I would have liked to have seen this. Yeah, so keep going. This is awesome.
Right. Well, as I say, the Reason article is the best thing. Really, Reason and NPR did this. So, yeah. I would say those are the two best, and I can send links later.
Yeah.
Although the rest, I would say the coverage by the New York Times and the Economist were just shameful, dishonest, shameful, horrible. But at any rate, got some accurate media out of that. The new legislation, now this is really brilliant. I would say, one of the concerns in a country like Honduras is, if you know much about Douglas North's work on the kind of natural state, how we go from, a place where basically cronies rule it to a more free market sort of place, is that, at some point you have to have some support from I would say, the oligarchs in order to create free markets. It's oddly, people think, crony capitalism is capitalism, but as you and I know, it's not at all. Most governments around the world are established by rent-seeking elites who basically, they get the airport concession, or they, run the newspapers, or they control the banks. I would say one of the reasons the left hates capitalism is, quote, capitalism is very often it's elite by elites for elites. And the whole history of economic liberalization saying, no, we need to let the ordinary person have as much of a chance. That's why the No Republic thing is so outrageous to me. But one of the ways in which the Honduran designed this legislation, the ZA legislation, is that 12% of the taxes of any ZA jurisdiction must go to a trust, and that trust gets divided between the legislative branch, the executive branch, the military, the judicial branch, and the municipalities. And so in a sense, that's just an explicit off the top, we need to keep everybody happy.
Right.
We're going to have the money flow there. The other piece is it has to flow through a Honduran bank. And there's nothing wrong with that, but in practice, there are 2 or 3 Honduran banks owned by the rich families, and so they necessarily get to float. Okay, nothing. I would much rather have these things where these people, get their money publicly off the top in ways that everybody can see and visible. Separately from that, kind of the way these things work. Curiously, when some of these zones are created, it looks like it happens to be in regions where elite families happen to own land. So. But then, if it results in jobs and prosperity, who cares?
Yeah.
That's my attitude. As long as, they don't steal. And there are a lot of, there are land battles and land wars and real violence and some horrible things happening in Honduras. And in India with the zones, there was violence associated with confiscated land. So, respecting property rights in a principled way is rule number one. But to go into a little bit of the political economy of zones, so one of the people I worked with for many years was a man named Bob Haywood, who used to be the executive director of the World Economic Processing Zones Association. And Haywood, I think, brilliantly noticed that zones around the world came into being as a way around the problem of the crony capitalist state as discussed by North, usually when not the center oligarchs, but people around the periphery, like the second cousin or the in-laws or the third brother, or people who did not have the big concessions supported zone legislation as a way for them to get, rich, basically, because they saw the center families doing well, and so they managed to have enough influence on the government to lobby for freedom, but they were not already part of the establishment. And by means of that, the great thing about a zone is, you're not liberalizing the whole economy, so you're not threatening the entire rent-seeking structure, but you're creating islands of freedom, elsewhere in the country. And so, in many ways, this allows for, I would also say, more innovative and entrepreneurial people within a country to really take off. So, all of that to say that I'm very excited about the Honduran ZA legislation. It sort of came to a halt for a few years because what's called the Committee for the Adoption of Best Practices was sort of stuck. And just to go into a riff on the governance. So the way this works, and one of the reasons I think it's such brilliant legislation, is with all situations around the world, the real challenge is how do we get the government from taking things? And so why would a corporation spend $1 million, $5 million, $50 million on a manufacturing plant, if the government's just going to take it? And of course, that's been a real problem around the world. Used to be a big problem in Latin America, less so bit by bit, and I'll talk about that. Um, but the number one thing is that for investment to take place, there's got to be trust that it won't be confiscated. And the more deeply there is trust, the more companies are likely to invest. Part of what made Singapore rich is people trusted Lee Kuan Yew, not people. Corporate heads trusted Lee Kuan Yew not to confiscate. And over time, he developed a great reputation for that. So one of the ways in which they've done that is they've created what the first time was called the Transparency Commission. This time is called the Committee for the Adoption of Best Practices, which is an independent board separate from the Honduran government. And this independent board is actually responsible for managing the jurisdictions. And what that does is, because the board is made up of an international committee, and the idea is to have people who are not part of the crony system in the country, and who typically have reputations that are perhaps more valuable and a little payoff here and there. The idea is to have this independent governing network. What's great about this version of the project is they're very free market. The members of this committee are very free market, and are very committed to maintaining the integrity of the zones. It took a little while for them to figure out how to develop a process for allowing private entities to develop zones. In the last year, they've settled that out, and they've got a process now. And we are in the process of getting a zone approved. And once that's ready, the legislation is in place. The idea is we could actually work in creating one of the most free market, probably the most free market jurisdiction in the world. So very exciting. So yeah, just to give you a little bit. So one of the big things is, how can you trust a government, even with this sort of independent thing? And there are a couple of things. One is, it turns out that it's useful that Honduras is part of CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, because just to give you a concrete example, Honduras is the #1 importer of cotton thread from the United States in the world. Basically, a lot of cotton thread goes down there, gets made into T-shirts, and comes back up. But what that means is that if there's a violation of CAFTA, the U.S. government can impose sanctions on Honduras that would devastate the economy. So that's a way of saying, don't mess with CAFTA. And there's also something called a stationary clause, where when we sign an agreement with Honduran government, we can put a stationary clause. And by the way, the libertarian attorney Stephen Kinsella is an expert in this. We can sign a stationary clause that will prevent later changes in legislation from interfering with the terms of the contract when we signed it.
Oh.
So it's stationary based on when we signed it. And then, I've learned a lot about international law since I've got on this project. I didn't know a lot of this stuff 10 years ago. I mean, it turns out that, with respect to the U.S., regulatory takings, as articulated by Richard Epstein, the great classical liberal legal scholar, it's controversial. Oh, can the government be forced to reimburse for a regulatory taking? It turns out in international business law, it's much less controversial. And there have been many cases where international arbitration boards have forced countries to reimburse corporations for regulatory takings.
Wow.
Yeah. So, not a guarantee, but, it's significantly better than people believe. And some of this is because 40 years ago, Latin American countries were confiscating, corporate assets all the time. So the last, 30 years of globalization we've seen put in place a really decent set of protections. Not perfect, but much better. And there are countries that don't respect these things. Not all countries are signatory to the New York Convention on Arbitration and various other sorts of things. But most of the countries that are deeply connected in the globalized system now are part of these treaties that assure compliance. And there are real teeth when they violate the compliance. Finally, there are things like...
Oh no. Broke up again.
private investors, private investors. Oh, but can you hear me?
It just... Okay, yeah, now it's good.
Me?
Wait. Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
Stop
Continue.
for a minute.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say that there are both World Bank insurance for private investment,
Okay.
and currently in the U.S., OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation. As an aside, Trump wants to eliminate OPIC, which is fine. I'm enough of a libertarian to say, but if it's there and we can get it, why not have the government backing up your investment?
Right.
Both with OPIC and the World Bank alternative, which I'm forgetting, the way it works is if it turns out that a government does confiscate your investment, the insurance reimburses the investors and then takes the country to court. So if the court case stretches off 3, 4, 5, 10 years or whatever, the U.S. or the World Bank basically is responsible for chasing after the money, whereas your investors are made whole right away. In addition to that layer, we've also looked at private insurance on top of that, and the private insurance has been coming in around private investment insurance around 1% or so, which is really not too bad. And it shows the private insurers, basically trust the system. Still bad things can happen and so forth. Ultimately, the most important thing is to be popular on the ground. So beyond all of this legal talk, one of the reasons that I've been involved in these is I am an expert in education, care passionately about education and social mobility. The real fear of Hondurans is that this legislation would be used for wealthy North Americans to create enclaves, and the Hondurans would be poor maids and gardeners. And I think that's a legitimate concern. So I've been very committed to designing various paths upward in terms of education, productivity, careers. Give you one little example of that. Nearshoring is big in Central America. So it started with outsourcing 20, 30 years ago, corporations sending back office stuff to India. But India is a hell of a flight. Your middle managers, whatever, are just exhausted from going back and forth to India. Meanwhile, Honduras is the most English-speaking of all the Latin American countries, and it's low wage. So basically the call center and the data processing nearshoring in Honduras is booming, and this will allow it to grow even faster. We're also working with a Guatemalan company that has pioneered the notion of taking their best call center employees and training them in graphic design, coding, user interface design. So they go, if you've worked for them for the call center for 3, 4, 5 years, who's responsible, smart, on the ball, articulate, and so forth. So they can train their best employees to go even farther up the value chain. So that's just a little anecdote of one of the ways in which we're proactively designing systems to ensure that locals have increased opportunity, and I think accelerated opportunity relative to the rest of the economy. Just to give you one of the kind of stupid laws in Honduras, in order to work in a maquila, you have to have a high school diploma. And, although the left hates maquilas, for most Hondurans, a maquila job is a darn good job. And they arbitrarily force you to get a high school diploma.
What's a maquila?
It's a factory, basically.
Okay, right.
The left would call them sweatshops, but,
Sure.
T-shirts.
Yeah.
Hundreds, thousands of, not always women, but often women sewing clothes.
Yeah.
But it's a decent job. It's much better than agricultural labor or no labor at all, or trying to get to the U.S. and be cheated, raped, killed by the coyotes, forced to smuggle drugs in your anus or whatever. So locally, maquilas are respected, and they're really great opportunities. So we want to have both whatever jobs that are beneficial to the people, but especially let's move up the white collar value chain. So that's just a really quick overview of a lot, and I realize we're kind of running in on 15 minutes, so I'm going to pause and see what questions you have, because I could go in a million different directions.
Oh man, that was awesome. That really that filled in a ton of holes in my understanding of this whole thing and these issues. So, do you have kind of more you want to say, or should I? Or I can ask questions if you have more you want to get to. Just go ahead.
So let me just do a little bit more than this. So,
okay, sure.
I think one of the things I often talk about, I talk about these zones often, is that once you think of zones as a way to prosperity, again, In some ways, Hong Kong and Singapore approved the concept. In some ways, the Chinese Special Economic Zones. In other ways, the Dubai International Financial Center. Hopefully, the Honduran Zeds. Then I think of the world as zoned for poverty, and that was stupid. Let's zone it for prosperity. So just as if, often real estate developers get a piece of property zoned from, say, residential to commercial, overnight 3x increase in value. If you think about most of the world is zoned with really crappy law, if we could rezone it to world-class law and bring billions of people out of poverty, why wouldn't we do that?
Right.
So, I'm trying to get people to think this is the coolest technology. Again, technology, most people think cell phones, computers, washing machines, whatever. This is innovation in legal technology, where if we can really create a global industry of not just Honduras or Dubai or China, but in countries around the world, experimenting with all sorts of new kinds of zones, with custom designed legal and regulatory systems. With all systems, we evolve towards improvement. Well, for me, the number one reason I believe in free enterprise is anything that is where entrepreneurs can do so through free enterprise. The result is lower cost, higher quality, and more differentiated product. So right now, governments are basically responsible for world poverty. Most governments everywhere are keeping their people poor. Let's create more of these zones where we can have faster to prosperity, more effective, efficient government, and bring billions of people out of poverty. And by the way, reduce the likelihood of violence and war while we're doing it. Just in thinking of, suppose entrepreneurs could design jurisdictions from scratch. Right now, Estonia has the world's leading e-government, and there are other countries that are doing e-government. But one of my big frustrations is, going to the motor vehicles to get my driver's license. It's just long lines, yada, yada, yada. Meanwhile, with businesses, you can do pretty much everything online, quick, fast, easy, one-click Amazon. What if everything you could ever needed to do with government was quick, easy, online, and governments competed, or government suppliers, e-government suppliers basically, competed to have the most efficient government services on earth. You can imagine not just first generation, but second, third, fourth generation, everything having to do with government would just be just as efficient. A couple of the brainstorming me and my team have talked about, imagine if you could track, say, from the time, so, some libertarians are against tax. The fact is, there will be payments to improve services. If you live in a particular street, you may need to get a pothole fixed. But imagine if you could watch from time you made the payment, or you and everybody else made the payment, to exactly where it went, who got paid what, which things got fixed on what timeline. There are good organizations working towards government transparency, but once we have competing jurisdictions with competing e-government, it'll be radically transparent, and we'll see the cost of everything. There'll be efficiency metrics and so forth. So you can imagine, even other evaluators who run tests on e-government systems to see which is the fastest, most transparent, more effective. And most of the crap we live with will be gone. There will still be some kinds of regulatory systems. Do a riff on that. One of the industries we're targeting is healthcare innovation, both medical tourism and healthcare innovation. We don't want completely crazy people, doing operations with a hacksaw in a back room. So we'll have some threshold of credibility, but much more free market than anything that exists. But we need to, it's our job, because we have a brand, we have a reputation as a jurisdiction provider, it's our job to identify smart, responsible experts in healthcare and healthcare innovation who can sort through the nonsense sorts of treatment from potentially promising treatments, who can provide adequate sort of passive consent, who can create a whole system for evaluating which treatments on what timetable should require what sorts of due diligence and so forth and so on. So you can imagine a whole innovation system around that. Building codes. We don't want everything to burn down, so probably have some standards. Because fire is a bad thing, and it is contagious, so to speak. But do we think the city of Chicago has an optimized fire code enforcement. I don't think anything cog is optimized. So what is an optimized building codes and fire enforcement system look like? Environment. We care passionately about the environment. We're looking at some places that have really ecologically sensitive reefs. Right now, the laws on the books in Honduras protect the reefs, but they're really not enforced. So how can we create much more efficient systems for enforcing the law to actually protect the environment? It goes on and on and on. So finally, I do one more riff and then pause again. I'm most excited about innovations in education, healthcare, and even mutual aid societies / welfare systems. Many people think, oh, free market, no welfare. No, as we know from a lot of historical research, there were mutual aid societies before the rise of the welfare state, and David Beto has done brilliant work on this. We want to recreate these sorts of mutual aid societies, and there would probably be, in some cases, by nonprofits, in some cases by churches, in some cases might be completely private. Maybe we'll get groups of social entrepreneurs, and then in every case, the mutual aid societies would be responsible not only for welfare, but also, as with 19th century mutual aid societies, for ensuring members adhere to certain standards of behavior. So, if you are repeatedly a jerk, back in the old days, people would say, come on, shape up, you're costing us money and so forth. And what do modern systems of that look like? Between, again, some of the people who are involved in our project are not ideological libertarians at all. They're just, technologists, and they see the potential of technology to make everything faster, better, cheaper. And once you realize we are free to create our own legal regulatory jurisdiction from the ground up, then the technologists can go wild in terms of how do we optimize everything. So, for me, basically, I see, I'm pretty utopian, paradise. Just let's just get this going. So I'm currently writing a book. It's kind of a guidebook for how to support and promote this movement. And I'll share a draft with you, and people that are interested. Yeah. I'd love to have them, because I want this to be a pragmatic manual. Probably, I want to get as many people out there understanding this deeply. Part of this is there are kind of, I would say, shallow advocacy of let's create a free market paradise. And in order to win at this, I think a lot more people need to understand all of the difficult issues. One of our investors, to our credit, we've got a really brilliant potential investment partner with whom we're doing due diligence on both sides. But he has this wonderful worksheet of the hard problems. What do you do about welfare? What do you do about immigrants? What do you do about dangerous criminals? You can't just say the market will solve it. If you're creating your own jurisdiction that's going to be responsible for building a credible brand, you need really solid, credible answers backed up by professionals who have real experience doing this. And finally, one of the challenges is most existing professionalism is de facto with legacy jurisdictions. So my vision of innovative in every direction, not quite there yet. So we're also interested in providers of all sorts of services, municipal services, security services, regulatory services, educational services, healthcare services, who are on the vanguard of innovation, who are seeking jurisdictions where they can go one step beyond what they've been able to do because of the crappy legal regulatory framework of meat jurisdictions. So pause there and give you another shot, because I can rant. I could go on and everything.
Okay. Well, so it is approaching an hour. I said it'd be an hour. I can go longer if you want to talk a little bit more. But if you have to go, that's totally fine. But I do have some questions. Okay. One thing you said was interesting to me about how you need to have solutions to the problem. You don't just say the market will solve it. That is what I have been saying to all these people. It's really easy kind of cop out that a lot of libertarians do, in my opinion. And they say, we want a free society, so to speak. And you say, well, how is this going to work? How is that going to work? They say, oh, well, I just know that markets work and someone's going to do it. Well, okay, fine. But then let's say that we actually had that. Someone is going to have to do it. right? So the person's obviously not going to be you, but someone needs to figure this out. Um, and so I really like that. I really like that philosophy. One thing I'm really interested in, what I've been kind of researching in the past few months is, as you were saying, mutual aid societies, and one thing I'm interested in is how best to deliver security services. And so there's this organization in Detroit called the Threat Management Center. I don't know if you've heard of them.
Oh yeah, big fans.
Oh
Yep.
yeah, so I've actually, I've been working with them, learning about their operation. Right now, I'm just helping them out with their technology. I'm a programmer, so I'm helping. I'm doing some like technology consulting with them and stuff. And I just told Commander Brown, the CEO, I said, yeah, I just want to learn about kind of what you guys do, and I want to figure out like ways of like delivering secure, like alternative models of delivering security to people, like not just like pay for a security guard type of thing. Like there's other ways of doing it. You can think about like mutual aid societies and insurance policies and stuff like that. So that's really interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned that, but. Anyway, back to what I was kind of getting at. How do you find that balance? Because there is a balance, though, right? Because you don't want to make the same mistake that the other governments did, where they tried to centrally plan everything. Like to some extent, you need to just kind of have the jurisdiction out there, this is like a free market, so you kind of need to just say, well, I think people will actually figure it out. We're not going to have to. We can't set up everything. Like how do you find that balance?
No, that's a great question. Well, first, just to back up, and I think we will go a little bit beyond an hour. First, yeah, I big time agree with the we got to have solutions, and then the other thing is, I think it's I just have huge respect for the fact that you're working with threat management in Detroit. I mean, because really it gets down to getting your hands dirty and doing it. Most entrepreneurial ventures fail. Entrepreneurship is really hard work, whether it's nonprofit, for-profit, whatever. I spent most of my life creating schools. It's really hard work. And, I've got a lot of experience on the ground with students, with faculty, with parents, how to get stuff done, where things go wrong, yada, yada, yada. And that gives me just a much more realistic sense of what might be possible or necessary. Mm-hmm. And so one way to think of this is, yes, we want freedom. And one thing about describing it as, the most free market jurisdiction in the world is we want lots of competitive things. So in education, I have a network. I know lots of interesting educators. I can put lots of cool things on the ground. We will seed the zone with, I would say, great education and diverse forms of great education. That said, in no sense will any of the educational projects we're seeding have any sort of advantage over new entrants. And so the idea is, hey, we want to get something started just because, we want people on day zero or, year one or whenever it is to have great options. Healthcare, too, we're busy kind of attracting different people, different organizations with some experience. But you don't want to give them any sort of privileged position. That's the kind of outrage in everywhere else is, a vendor has a privileged system. Security is a little bit trickier, but that's where, because, I'm not a fan of the version of anarcho-capitalism where two different neighbors might have competing security agencies. I think it's just, for the foreseeable future, much simpler to have geographically coherent security.
Right.
Just, too messy. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I'm a big fan of Spencer McCullum and Spencer Heath's work of, thinking of this like a shopping mall, where a shopping mall, every store in the shopping mall has, pretty much complete control over what goes on in the store. And yet the common places, they all pay for common security and so forth. And then they need to abide by the security as well. But so we're actively working to identify leading vendors in every sector. I'm also encouraging, idealistic people who want to get in this to, quit writing stuff and get involved in nuts and bolts projects. So just the fact that you've got experience doing this instantly makes you interesting and worth talking to at some point, because the legacy problem is huge. If people only have experience in legacy, they won't know how to do it in new ways. And yet we absolutely have to have experienced people, because to do anything well, you need systems. You can't you can't create an entire new education system, healthcare system, security system on day one. These things take years and years. So, I would say that we are scouting this sort of talent, and I want to encourage everybody who went to this movement to see where they can be on the vanguard of developing new solutions within existing, jurisdictions, and looking for a future where, with a little bit more freedom, they could do so much more.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that this work that you're doing is really great. But I guess I don't want to go over a little too long, but you're doing some other stuff too, though. So just really quick, could you tell me about some of your other projects, like KoSchool and other things?
Sure. So, as passionate as I am about startup cities, in some ways my first passion is education.
Right.
And one of my quick riff on that is I love learning and I hate school. I just hate school. I mean, I regard secondary school as the most boring and cruel years of my life. Why did I have to be bored? As an adult, I'm never bored, not for a second.
Right.
Maybe in the DMV, but that's about as close to boredom as I got. And cruel, jerks. As an adult, if somebody's a jerk, I don't hang out with them. So, as an adult, life is happy, interesting, fun, exciting, fulfilling. And yet we put kids in this prison when they are forming their most critical life habits. And so basically I see the average secondary school is a place where, kids are more or less, maybe not all kids, maybe only 70 to 80% of the kids are destroyed. And then the 20 or 30% of the like school go on and replicate it forever. They become the adult professionals who believe in school. Meanwhile, we've got this wasteland coming after them. And so, I see school as we know it, as radically destructive. So I've spent much of my life creating different kinds of school. KoSchool, there are people who are fans of Sudbury, kind of do whatever you want sort of school. They call it democratic schooling. We have more structure than that. So in order to satisfy the need for college admissions, we offer AP courses, and we offer also have our students all take the SAT 3 times a year. Yeah. So, basically if a student gets great SAT scores, does well on a few AP tests, and then does an incredible project, they're in great shape to go to whatever college they want.
Yeah.
To go to Harvard, MIT, it has to be a really incredible project. But when I went to Harvard, the kid with the lowest SAT scores had been mayor of a small town in Michigan at the age of 18. You can do that. Nobody cares. So I have all these families that are, what about college? No, be incredible.
Right.
The Teal Fellowship. I love the Teal Fellowship. Drop out of college, get $100,000 to go do something real. So we encourage our students to do significant projects, and a lot of them fail. A lot of fail faster sorts of things, but we want them doing stuff. Have them take some AP courses so they can prove they can do college level work well, and then on the SAT, my specialty is Socratic dialogue. We read difficult, sophisticated texts, sometimes the classics, sometimes contemporary academic articles. Read and discuss them every day. We also have a math problem solving that gets kids to kind of think mathematically. In addition, we follow linear Khan Academy, so Khan makes the linear part easy, but we also want them to be, innovative, interesting mathematical thinkers. And then we have a required personal development course where we go through things like mindfulness, goal setting, direct communication as opposed to, gossip and all of that stuff. Basically healthy, decent, responsible, proactive people with integrity. So our required course consists simply of the personal development, Socratic humanities, and math problem solving. And if students only want to take that and do the rest of the time on their projects, they're free to do so. We've got one student who has a company managing heavy metal concerts, where he gets the venue, he sells tickets, he's got his own heavy metal band, is smart enough to know, hey, if I produce a concert, I can play the venue.
Right.
And he's putting on concerts at the age of 16, and it has a business. And that's, other than the 3 core courses, that's what he does. So between classes, he's on his cell phone, making deals and getting things happening, and getting bands and so forth. So we want kids to be doing real stuff, because for me, and this goes back to school is destructive. I think one of the greatest obstacles to social mobility in the United States is public education. The left thinks, more funding for public education. We've tripled funding for public education in the last 30 years. The results have gone down. We now spend second to highest in the OECD on public education per pupil, and it's a disaster. I actually think that uh, public schools are responsible for mental illness by and large. Depression, bipolar, and schizophrenia all tend to get started in late teens, early 20s, often lifetime debilitating. And school connectedness is one of the greatest ways to prevent certainly clinical depression, and there's some evidence the other
Wow.
outcomes. And school connectedness, some kids are connected to a big public school, but 4,000 kids, you've got the geeks and the skaters and the jocks and everything. A lot of kids are disconnected. When you see shooters, most of the time when you see these shooters at schools, it turns out they were disconnected. They felt isolated and so forth. Healthy human relationships are everything. Lifetime health and well-being. Most healthcare expenditures are chronic diseases. Chronic diseases, bad habits. You get into substance abuse and or no physical activity and eating sugar and crap when you're a teenager, more likely to do that lifetime. So basically, I see developing healthy habits and attitudes in age 10 to 20 as the solution to almost everything. So to spin that back around to the mutual aid societies, ultimately, I'd love to see mutual aid societies give discounts to schools that do a better job of inculcating good habits and attitudes. You can imagine, I'm sure some families where, wow, those kids are so responsible, and other families like, oh, are you crazy? And then educators can have an impact too. And so if educations and families and everybody in the mutual aid society network are rewarded for good habits, and everybody is penalized for bad habits, finally we can internalize the impact of good schooling and good parenting. And, again, in an evolutionary process, we'll develop an incredible system over several decades for helping people become better parents and better educators, better in every way. So, you get the whole thing. But,
Yeah.
I go on and on and on and on. So basically, my fundamental theme is free market everything. Ultimately, I am an ANCAP. I see the U.S. as a hegemon for the next century, I hope. I'd rather have U.S. be hegemon than China or Russia. But at some point, I'd love to see ANCAP, and I see the zones as a path to ANCAP, where we increasingly privatize legal systems, governance, jurisdictions. And while the U.S. is blowing its money on defense, hopefully we get thousands of these jurisdictions that make Hong Kong, Singapore, and Dubai look like primitive, make Austin and San Francisco look primitive. We have the most incredible places blossoming around the world. And as with everything, faster, cheaper, better, more differentiated. Imagine instead of iPhones, we have this for health, education, welfare, law, governance, community. Everything bad is because of government. Let's just underthrow government by having more entrepreneurs do these little projects. Give you one final thing. At some point you see the role of government like the Queen of England. The Queen of England, she's expensive. The British government puts a lot of money on her. People still kind of, worship her, wave at parades or whatever. But basically, she's, just a figurehead without any real power. I'd like to see 50 or 100 years from now, most governments as these, vestigial things. So, let's just go ahead and create a fantastic world, beneath the radar, and gradually we'll make government irrelevant.
Well, on yeah, totally. On that, I think we should end it. But I just want to say, I wish I could have gone to KoSchool, because that sounds like something exactly what I needed when I was in grade school. But anyways, we have a lot. We have a lot we could talk about. I'd love to have you on again sometime, and we could just explore some of these more ideas. I'd like to maybe talk about anarcho-capitalism, and maybe hash out why you don't think that there would be, or why you think a geographic area would be, a geographic monopoly would be better than a polycentric system. So awesome. I'll end the
All right.
recording.
Okay, thanks.